We are hungry for the approval of others. Often, this hunger gets concentrated in particular individuals, a boss, mentor, partner, etc. We think that the object of our desire is this individual's approval, yet the source generating our desire for this approval is not this or that person, nor is it located in some consciously held subjective choice. Instead, the cause of our desire is a gaze irreducible to the individual, a look we experience externally, but is in fact an immanent part of our subjectivity that we're ceaselessly attempting to appease. For this reason, if and once we finally obtain approval from this individual, that is, we get our object, we are inevitably disappointed by it and find ourselves seeking approval in yet another figure. In every different object, we're moved by the same cause, not because the cause is uniquely embodied in every object, but because we, our subjectivities, are continuously reinscribed in objects. This example illustrates a central idea presented in the first chapter, wherein Zizek begins by reconceiving the classic duality of subject and object. To contextualize Zizek's argument concerning the relation between subject and object, it will be helpful to keep in mind the standard formulation of the subject-object duality. The scientific standard of truth demands that our knowledge of the objective world not be influenced by the messy contingencies of subjective experience. As such, a central philosophical issue entails establishing the conditions of possibility for overcoming the vagaries of our unreliable first-person perspective by acceding to the unchanging certainty of a third-person objective perspective. A solution to this issue, one found most readily in the standard interpretation of Kant, is to conceive of the subject as an active agent who contains within itself universal categories by which it can construct a reliable view of reality shared by all rational beings. The object in this formulation, then, is a passive construction of this active universal agent. The first move Zizek makes is to flip the characteristics ascribed to the subject and object. The subject no longer refers to an active agent, but means to subject or submit oneself to something. This act of submitting marks the subject with a fundamental passivity. The object, in turn, is no longer the passive construction of an active subject, but means to object or oppose in the sense of creating an obstacle, thereby conferring upon the object a fundamental activity. What kind of object is this? Zizek names it the Parallax Object, an object that disrupts and disturbs, or objects to, the smooth running of things for the subject. In the example provided, it is that inscribed cause of desire that interrupts the possibility of satisfaction from the desired object. In other words, it is a way the object actively inscribes me within it, constituting a blind spot for me, an invisible stain that hinders me from beholding the whole of reality that is embodied by the object. This parallax object is equivalent to what Lacan names objet petit, that intangible element in the desired object that generates our desire in the first place. Zizek will also call it the tickling object, meaning that which moves the subject while also disturbing and undermining it. What induces the shift from one view of the object to the other? Zizek suggests that it's something that can never be pinned down in its particular properties, since it is that part of oneself that is in the object more than it is something one would identify in oneself. We're not dealing with two distinct objects, but one object that is divided within itself. This split is one and the same with the other object that emerges from it. In other words, this difference, as such, immediately coincides with an unfathomable object. In contrast to a mere difference between objects, the pure difference is itself an object. And this is what Zizek calls the minimal difference. a difference that divides the same object from itself, producing an unfathomable object that cannot be grounded in any positive substantial properties. To suggest that there is a gap within the object itself brings us to a consideration of Zizek's distinct materialist ontology. His use of Malevich's artwork portraying a black square on a white background is illustrative here. The black area, inscribed within a white square, appears to be representing the point at which the subject's gaze is inscribed into the perceived object. Now, one way of reading this interpretation by Zizek is that there's some sort of subjective dimension of the object. And perhaps then we have something like Berkeley's epistemological thesis that to be is to be perceived. Yet, Zizek is proposing something a bit more nuanced here. Instead of reducing the ontological to the epistemological, wherein reality is fully contingent upon the activity of a knowing or perceiving subject, there is instead a kind of correlation between the epistemological shift of the subject and the shifting ontological reality of the object. Thus, another manner of interpreting Malevich's work is to say that there is a gap in material reality itself within which subjectivity is inscribed, that the subject belongs to the material, but that the material itself is incomplete. In this sense, the black square represents a void, an empty space that reveals a hole at the heart of reality, an absence at the heart of presence. And so what we have here are not two objects, a white square and a black square, but one object separated from itself, producing a pure or minimal difference. The white square has a hole in it that gives rise to the duality of the imagined whole square in contrast to the white square with a hole. Yet it's a difference made possible because the gaze of the viewer can never see the difference being produced by itself, and whereby it's inscribed in the object in such a way that two different perspectives are thereby produced on it. Now, this gaze I've been mentioning, Zizek identifies with the social big other, which for the subject is internalized as the ego ideal. It is part of one's immanent subjective identity, but it has an alien character to it. And it is the gaze that the subject seeks to satisfy in the objects it thinks it desires. A radical implication of all this is that material reality is not simply contingent upon subjective reality, but that subjective reality finds itself instantiated within an ontological incompleteness that is constitutive of objective material reality. Now, ordinarily, we have this transcendent, necessary, universal, completely independent reality and truth on one side, and then immanent, contingent, limited, finite experience on the other. The major shift Zizek seems to be proposing here is that the gap between subject and object is in reality itself. That reality is intrinsically incomplete, and that the gap is the necessary minimal difference for there to be a second position to emerge, the position of subjectivity and the immanent realm of finite human experience. Not only that, but now we have the difference, subject and object, which is preceded by a more fundamental gap within one of the terms. But now what happens is that subject and object are retroactively posited as fundamental terms, wherein in fact the gap between the two, which now seems fundamental, has been itself produced out of that preceding gap that resided immanently in one term. The conclusion of all this is that there is no primordial duality of poles, only the inherent gap of the one. Difference is not primary here, but is viewed as a structural effect of incompleteness. The pure minimal difference takes place as an antagonism internal to a single position. And going through this chapter, it kind of occurred to me that a term that seems to reflect this perspective being promoted by Zizek is a dialectical monism, which is to be distinguished, as he does in this chapter, from the monism of Spinoza. According to Zizek, Spinoza conceives of the one as a pure substance that expresses itself in different modes, such as subjectivity and objectivity. However, the unity underlying these modes marks what Zizek calls a symmetric parallax, wherein subject and object, or mind and body, are different modes of the same substance. and wherein there is no dynamic interaction in their differentiation. They are parallel expressions of one neutral medium or substance. The dialectical monism being proposed by Zizek, which he locates as originating in Hegel, provides an asymmetric parallax wherein one term stands on its own and the other term emerges out of the ontological gap of the first, while at the same time, the second term stands for the shift between these two terms. And if you're still confused by that double identity of the second term, I think it's going to make a little bit more sense once we get to the notion of the subject and the inhuman, which will be the theme of the next part. A second painting Zizek analyzes in this chapter is Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. The figure stands out against a background that doesn't seem to fit with the figure, and that in fact makes the figure of the Mona Lisa stand out in an excessive manner. The subject of the painting then is not merely the gestalt image of the human figure, but it emerges out of the disconcerting gap between figure and ground. The difference between the two positions, figure and background, provides a useful way of representing Zizek's notion of subjectivity at work here. Now, how so? Well, let's begin with the classic distinction of the human as representing one pole in the duality human-animal. According to this formulation, human subjects are distinct from animals by having some kind of superaddition to their animality, reason, soul, etc. And this has often produced the belief that there is an ontological gap between the human and animal. With the rise of naturalistic epistemologies, the tendency has been to show how what philosophers and theologians previously thought to be an essential distinction between human and animal is in fact not one. The resulting move then is to turn to some kind of monism, often reducing humans to a mere variation of the animal, or more rarely to raise animals to the level of the human. For Zizek, human subjectivity is not something opposed to our animality, but nor is it reducible to a pure animality. Rather, this subjectivity is an excess produced out of a distorted animality, an animal that, like the Mona Lisa, is not well integrated into its environment. An animal that is simply incapable of living according to the pleasure principle and the straightforward natural tendencies of adaptation and homeostasis. Zizek names this excess, which is neither purely animal nor fully human, as the inhuman. And this is what Zizek identifies as the subject. The inhuman constitutes the gap between the human and animal, an uncanny valley, so to speak, and perhaps can be reflected in such figures in film as The Fly or The Thing. This zero level or ground of subjectivity marks the interspace between human and animal. It's a gap, not something substantial. The subject, in turn, never fully coincides with itself. And what we find here is very much like what Lacan says about the split subject, who, born out of an incompleteness of animality, is never fully identified with its humanity either. And yet, despite never fully coinciding with ourselves, we still recognize ourselves as human. And this, in fact, is what makes us human. We're human not because of some intrinsic trait of humanity, but because we are the messed up animal that recognizes ourselves as human, who fills in the constitutive non-substantial inhuman gap of subjectivity with an identity that confers upon us our humanity. So we can see here the same logic at work with the parallax object, now at work with this parallax subject. The difference between human and animal lies in the gap of a peculiar animality that makes possible the second term, human, which we then confer primordiality upon retroactively as having named and attempted to fill the gap left over in the shift from the non-human to the inhuman. Of course, Zizek is not interested in matters of ontology and subjectivity merely for themselves. He has a critical aim here. Although much of that inquiry will be left to the final section of the book, he provides us some insight as to where he'll be heading in his analysis of political economy, which is appropriate in the context of this first chapter, since to understand the contradictions of capitalism will require a consideration of its own internal contradictions born of a minimal difference between desire and drive, a distinction that ties directly into the parallax object and parallax subject. So as the story goes, capital emerged as a simple means of satisfying people's needs that replaced the bartering system by mediating the exchange of commodities through introducing a universal equivalent among all commodities, money. So rather than trade my cow for 2 sheep, now I can exchange my cow for a certain amount of money, and depending on how much sheep costs, I can use that cash to purchase a certain number of sheep. However, this circulation undergoes a transformation and reversal wherein the means for exchange, capital, has turned into an end in itself. So we move from commodity, money, commodity to money, commodity, money. In other words, the commodity has become a means to producing more capital. And consequently, the aim is not the satisfaction of need, but an endless repeating of the circulation of money itself. Underlying this new function of capital is a disavowed, unconscious fantasy that capitalism produces some mysterious, self-generating circular movement that will never come to an end. This unconscious fantasy is then conjoined with the overt belief that the ultimate aim of capital's circulation is the continued satisfaction of human need rather than the circulation of capital for its own sake. It's only at times of crisis wherein the underlying belief that money is the only commodity becomes directly asserted. Such crises are something that are intrinsic to capitalism. This is because capital, in fact, is not self-generating but operates through the exploitation of the worker's surplus value. It parasitizes upon the proletariat that it depends upon, and by consuming itself from within, crisis is inevitable. So how does this analysis fit within the larger consideration of parallax happening in this chapter? It seems to be through the dialectical relation between desire and drive. Capitalism celebrates the desire to desire ever new objects and modes of pleasure. It interpolates individuals as subjects of desire, as consumers, and solicits in them ever new perverse and excessive desires that certain products can only satisfy. What Zizek is calling here the metonymy of desire. Each positive object functions as a metonymic substitute for this fundamental loss around which capitalism circulates. Drive, in contrast, is a counter-movement to desire. Whereas desire is moved by this whole toward a ceaseless search for substitute satisfactions, drive circles around the curved space of this whole. It does not aim directly at an object like desire, but aims at this ceaseless circulation itself. Its object, so to speak, is the loss that's induced by capitalism itself. Hence why drive is always a drive to enact the loss rather than to fill it with something else. It's a drive that inheres in capitalism at a most fundamental level, more fundamental than desire, propelling the whole capitalist machinery. And herein we behold the parallax view of capitalism. From one perspective, capitalism produces a lack that generates a desire to fill it with ever-shifting commodities. From another perspective, capitalism is produced by a drive toward an unconscious fantasy of ever-flowing abundance. It seeks out loss itself, but the loss is, according to the unconscious fantasy, generative of an excess, unbounded enjoyment. The repetition of failure creates a satisfaction of its own, then. It is a drive to enjoy life in excess, to be passionately attached to a surplus that derails the ordinary run of things. So desire and drive support one another within the capitalist machine, but only on condition that they not be reduced to one another. It's their unresolved contradiction whereby they support each other, and not some underlying synthesis of the two. So to conclude, as I was reading this part, I was also thinking about Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus and their view on capitalism. And certainly Zizek and Deleuze and Guattari share a lot of similarities. Both sides seem to agree that capitalism is related to lack. Furthermore, both sides seem to recognize a kind of excess internal to the capitalist machine, what Deleuze and Guattari named the desiring machine, but Zizek names here drive. A critical difference between the two, as far as I can tell, is that Deleuze and Guattari seem to suggest that the lack born of capitalism is due to it assuming within itself the totalitarian machine that stops up flows of capital, leading it to concentrate it only in a few rather than allowing for the uncontrolled excess of capital to run wild. The problem doesn't appear to be too much capitalism, but perhaps too little. For Zizek, by contrast, it would seem that the excess of the drive and the lack of desire are fundamentally intertwined in capitalism. That capitalism entails the dialectical relationship between the two, and not that one marks an artificial limit upon the other. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. So I hope you enjoyed and are approving of this video. And if you are, I'm sure I'll be dissatisfied and will go on to make more videos ceaselessly. So with that, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.